Hello humans, my name is Adam, and today we will be delving into one of the most disturbing and infamous chapters of science. The Stateville Penitentiary Experiment.
Chapter 1. Introduction. The Stateville Penitentiary Experiment was a medical study conducted in the 1940s in which prisoners were infected with malaria in order to test new anti-malarial drugs. The experiment, which was led by Dr. Alf Alving of the University of Chicago and carried out in collaboration with the U.S. Committee on Medical Research, remains a controversial and troubling episode in the history of medical research. The Stateville Penitentiary Experiment is significant for several reasons. Firstly, it contributed to the development of effective treatments for malaria, a disease that had a significant impact on public health at the time. The experiment helped to advance scientific knowledge and led to the development of new drugs that have saved countless lives. However, the experiment also raised important ethical questions about the use of vulnerable populations in medical research. The prisoners involved in the experiment were coerced into participating, and they were not given adequate information about the potential risks and benefits of the study. Many suffered severe symptoms of malaria as a result of the experiment, and some even died. The Stateville Penitentiary Experiment highlights the tension between the pursuit of scientific knowledge and the protection of human subjects in medical research. It raises important questions about the ethical considerations that must be taken into account when conducting research with vulnerable populations, such as prisoners. Chapter 2. The Experiment. The Stateville Penitentiary Experiment was conducted at the Stateville Correctional Center, a prison located in Joliet, Illinois. Alving and his team of researchers, Ray Dern and Ernest Butler, two physicians also from the University of Chicago, aimed to test the effectiveness of new anti-malarial drugs, including quinine and atabrine. They selected Stateville Penitentiary as the site of the experiment due to its large population of prisoners and the controlled environment that it provided. The experiment involved infecting prisoners with malaria and then treating them with the new anti-malarial drugs. The prisoners were divided into two groups. One group received quinine, while the other group received atabrine. The researchers monitored the prisoners' symptoms and collected data on the effectiveness of the drugs. In order to infect the prisoners with malaria, the researchers used mosquitoes that had been infected with the disease. The mosquitoes were allowed to feed on the prisoners, transmitting the malaria parasites into their bloodstream. The prisoners were not informed that they were being infected with malaria, and they were not given adequate information about the potential risks and benefits of the study. Many of the prisoners experienced severe symptoms of malaria as a result of the experiment, including high fevers, chills, and headaches. Some even suffered from complications such as pneumonia and kidney failure. At least one prisoner died as a result of the experiment. Despite these risks and ethical concerns, the experiment continued for several years. The researchers continued to infect prisoners with malaria and test new anti-malarial drugs, even though there was evidence that the drugs were causing serious harm to the prisoners. Chapter 3. Ethical Issues Raised by the Experiment. The Stateville Penitentiary Experiment raised a number of ethical concerns about the use of human subjects in medical research. The experiment was conducted without the informed consent of the prisoners, who were not fully aware of the potential risks and benefits of the study. One of the main ethical issues raised by the experiment was the use of coercion. The prisoners who participated in the experiment were not given a choice about whether or not to participate. They were vulnerable to coercion due to their position as prisoners, and they may have felt pressure to participate in order to gain favor with prison authorities. Another ethical issue raised by the experiment was the lack of medical oversight and supervision. The experiment was conducted without adequate medical supervision, and there were no mechanisms in place to monitor the prisoners' health or provide them with appropriate medical care. This lack of oversight may have contributed to the severe symptoms and complications experienced by some of the prisoners. The experiment also raised questions about the use of deception in medical research. The prisoners were not informed that they were being infected with malaria, and they were not given adequate information about the potential risks and benefits of the study. This lack of transparency raises serious ethical concerns about the use of deception in medical research, especially when vulnerable populations are involved. Finally, the Stateville Penitentiary experiment raised concerns about the racial and class biases that may have influenced the selection of the prison population as research subjects. Many of the prisoners at Stateville were poor and African American, raising questions about the social and economic inequalities that may have contributed to their vulnerability as research subjects. In response to these ethical concerns, medical research regulations have been developed to ensure that human subjects are protected from harm and exploitation. These regulations include requirements for informed consent, ethical review boards, and strict oversight and monitoring of research studies. Chapter 4. Aftermath and Legacy. In the years following the experiment, there were a number of legal and ethical repercussions that helped to shape the future of medical research. In 1964, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare established the Institutional Review Board (IRB) system, which provides oversight and review of all federally funded research involving human subjects. The IRB system requires that researchers obtain informed consent from study participants, and it establishes strict guidelines for the ethical treatment of human subjects. In addition to the development of new regulations, the Stateville Penitentiary experiment led to a greater awareness of the ethical issues involved in medical research. The experiment exposed the potential risks and harms associated with using vulnerable populations in research studies, and it sparked a broader public debate about the ethical implications of medical research. The legacy of the Stateville Penitentiary experiment also extends beyond the field of medical research. The experiment highlighted the conditions faced by prisoners in the U.S. criminal justice system, and it exposed the ways in which prisons are often used as sites for medical experimentation and other forms of exploitation. In recent years, there has been renewed attention to the use of prisons as sites for medical research. Some critics argue that prisons continue to be used as sites for medical experimentation, particularly in cases where prisoners are offered reduced sentences or other incentives for participating in research studies. Others argue that prisoners should be allowed to participate in research studies, but only under strict ethical guidelines that protect their rights and well-being. Chapter 5. Conclusion. The Stateville Penitentiary experiment was a deeply unethical and exploitative study that shed light on the potential risks and harms of using vulnerable populations in medical research. Although it was conducted over 70 years ago, its legacy continues to shape the public debate on the ethics of medical experimentation. The experiment was a wake-up call for the scientific community and the general public, as it exposed the vulnerability of prisoners in the U.S. criminal justice system and highlighted the need for greater protections for human subjects in research. The controversy surrounding the study prompted the development of new regulations and guidelines for medical research involving human subjects, such as the Institutional Review Board system, which seeks to prevent similar ethical breaches in the future. The legacy of the Stateville Penitentiary experiment is also a reminder that vulnerable populations, such as prisoners, continue to be at risk of exploitation and abuse in the name of scientific advancement. While it is essential to continue advancing medical research, it must be done with the utmost care and concern for the well-being and rights of the individuals involved. As the public debate on the ethics of medical experimentation continues, it is critical to acknowledge the lasting harm inflicted on the prisoners who were used as subjects in the Stateville Penitentiary experiment. We must also recognize their contributions to the development of new ethical standards in medical research, and we must continue to work towards protecting the rights and well-being of all human subjects in research studies. Ultimately, the legacy of the Stateville Penitentiary experiment is a powerful reminder of the need for rigorous ethical standards in medical research and the importance of respecting the dignity and rights of every individual, especially those who are most vulnerable.
While scientific progress is important, it should never come at the cost of exploiting the vulnerable. This experiment was a shameful chapter in human history that should serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of disregarding ethical considerations in medical research. So, let's do better, humans, and ensure that we advance scientific knowledge without sacrificing human dignity and respect.